Jai Baba. I'm Ward Parks here at Avatar's Abode for this month. My usual place of residence is Mehrabad in India. I've been a spiritual trainee there since 1994. So I'll be relating the account of how I came to Baba. And I just wanted to say about that project of telling the stories of Baba, that how you came to Baba, that Erich in Mandalay Hall would regularly elicit these stories from pilgrims who came. And I remember him sometimes, he would chide us saying, why don't you ask each other about this? In other words, why do you have to come to Mandalay Hall and have Erich do it? Why don't you talk to each other about that? And I somehow would have no way of knowing this, that Baba's lovers at present all have a link with him. That's what I think, that was actually created by him. And I do notice when people tell their stories of how they came to Baba, that quality comes out to me of the people telling how they consciously came to know about him. But I feel it actually was Baba who made the link and was bringing himself to their knowledge. So that flavor suffuses many of these stories. Hope it will be true of my story. So I was born in 1952, American. I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin. And my father was a university professor there. Of science, but biochemical science, very distinct. He was very famous in his field. And when I was 11, we moved to. He got a job at Brown University, which is one of the Ivy League schools. I'm saying this because it's pertinent. So I was always in this very intellectual atmosphere, scientific, not cultural, intellectual, and so through my whole teen years and thereafter, I was in Providence, Rhode Island, which is New England, Northeast, in the environment of, Harvard and Yale and all those sorts of things. So there was this very intellectual atmosphere, and there are all these intellectual centers there. And that was really the environment that I grew up in. It was secularized. There was never any kind of religion anywhere. I never knew anybody or never talked to anybody who believed in God. I mean, I'm sure there must have been people who did, but the topic never arose for me. And my family, it wasn't there either. As soon as I, got to be 13, I was reading existentialist books by Sartre and Camus and all these sorts of people. So that was my world. But as a kid, I heard of Baba at age 18 and came to him immediately, as I'll relate in the course of this. But it actually began when I was about 12 or 13. And so my whole story is as a kid, teenager, and there's a lot of melodramatic thinking that I was going through. I always thought that I was the first person ever to have thought of all the things I was thinking about, whereas now I know that it's very commonplace. But it seemed a big deal to me. And when I found Baba, I felt like I'd been searching for ages and ages and ages. So the kind of decisive moment that launched it off was when I was about 12 or 13. I was in Rhode Island, and in my family there was nothing like religion or God. It just never came up. I never even thought about it. But kind of the highest thing was politics. And I won't go into the particularities, but my family very strongly identified with one political party. We have two of them in America. And so I just assumed that I was that too. I didn't know anything about policies or what the real issues were. I just identified with this party. So I was out, playing with a soccer ball alone in front of the house one day, and the thought suddenly came to me, well, maybe I'm not a member of that party, maybe I'm a member of the other party. And it's not like I was thinking about what would be involved in that, but it's like I always thought that I was among the good people, but maybe I'm one of the bad people, because the other party was all bad. So, and it was a shock because, everybody always thinks I'm one of the good guys. But suddenly I thought, well, maybe I'm one of the bad guys. Maybe I'm not anything like what I thought I was. And it's sort of a silly thing, but it made it was a shock. And over the next couple of weeks, I was thinking a lot about how do people keep telling me all these things about what's real, but how do they know? And why should I believe anything that anybody says? Like I was in this scientific family, and one of the scientific boasts is science has debunked all the superstitions of previous ages. People used to think that the sun and the stars revolved around the earth, but Copernicus showed that the earth revolves around the sun. And I'd been taught that and, was interested, but suddenly I thought, well, how do I know that? Teachers have told me, and I've seen diagrams in books, but I don't actually know that. I'm just believing what other people say. And it's not that I really doubted that to be true, but but that was the day where America and the Soviet Union were competing for who would get to the moon first. So the topic was current. So I thought, well, suppose they put me up in a satellite and I could sit there for a week or two and observe for myself that the earth was revolving and the earth was moving around the sun. Well, why should I believe my own eyes? How do I know that what I see with my own, I didn't know it then, but this is radical skepticism. I was, thinking along those lines. Because I think that this room is here and you people are here and the camera is here because I see it. But I close my eyes and I don't see it anymore. So how do I know when my eyes are closed that it was there 2 seconds before? How does anybody know anything? So I was really sort of brooding on this, but the really important questions, I would read these books, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, or Lord of the Flies was a big book in those days. And I actually read Dostoevsky, who talks about a lot of these topics. As a matter of fact, Crime and Punishment. But the really important things were relating to the meaning of life. That was the phrase back in those days. What was the meaning of life? And immediately I realized that it all depends on whether God exists or not. And God doesn't exist. I never even gave God a serious chance back in those days. Because in my world, only stupid people would ever believe in God, who are deceived by old myths and don't have the guts to deal with reality. So I just took that as true. I didn't question that. But if God does not exist, there is no answer to the problem of death. That you die and it's finished. And all possibility of anything being meaningful or of value is completely destroyed by that. Because I was in a very highly competitive prep school, it's called, where people go on to good colleges and have good careers and all of that. And I was the best student in my class in those days. I was always very good at it. So let's suppose I had, wake up the next morning and have the best day anyone ever had. I went to school and I was brilliant and charming and everybody praised me. And I went on and had the most glorious high school career and had a fantastic college and career and was the most famous man who ever lived, right? And then I die. Well, it all came to nothing. And the likelihood of all these things happening, of my becoming the most famous man who ever lived, was very small. Everything else was worse than that. And if who remembers anybody for very long? The best I could ever hear from anybody about, why you should what makes life worthwhile is you make the world a better place and people remember you well after you die. That was kind of the best. But who remembers anybody for very long? I mean, you maybe 2 or 3 generations, you might remember your grandfather, or if you happen to be a famous person, and there aren't very many of them, 50 years, 100 years, or really famous people, you know, maybe 1,000 years, but from 10,000 years ago, we don't know anybody. So it's all going to vanish. And this is another problem. I mean, I would really brood on this about the meaning of life, and I'd say, okay, I myself am inherently worthless because I'm going to die. It will just vanish. So why does the way that other people think of me redeem that? Do they have inherent worth? But they're going to die too. There's no real point of permanent value anywhere in the picture because everyone dies. So life is inherently meaningless and worthless and hopeless. So, you know, I had this picture. Suppose I'm out at night, and Providence was, you know, chilly place, and you'd have rainy days like you have here. And I've got a little candle, and I'm walking across a wide field, and the wind is blowing, and I'm trying to keep the candle from being blown out. And at a certain point, it goes out, and that's the end. Then it's just blackness, and there's nothing more. That's what life is. It's inherently worthless and hopeless. This was not a very cheerful way of thinking, to say the very least. But so in view of that being the case, you know, all the input I was getting from school was I should be a good boy and work hard and, you know, be thought well of by others and go to a good college, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Again, I was very prepared to generalize about everyone else. No one has thought about this. Everyone is a coward. I hadn't actually talked to everyone to know whether they were cowards or not. But people are not facing this reality of death, and they keep clinging to these illusions that things are worth something when they're not. And I too was such a coward that even though I was thinking this way, I should have done some spectacular thing to prove, you know, that I didn't believe it at all. But I was doing my homework and being a good boy generally and not talking about this. So I was a coward myself. But the way you should actually live is complete, total selfishness. Not that there is any value in it. There isn't. But there's no value in anything. So like if I was walking down a street at night and somebody ahead of me I knew had a lot of money and I happened to want the money, I should kill them and take their money, you know. Well, would that make the world a better place? Of course not. It would make the world hell. But it doesn't matter whether the world is heaven or hell because it's all worthless. And if somebody else wanted to do the same to me, they should try to do that to me. But of course, I wouldn't want them to do that because my selfishness doesn't want that. That's actually the consequence of there being, of death and there being no God, that everything should be, there should be no morality, no delusion of permanent values or anything like that. So I thought a lot about this. This is nihilism, is a term for this whole way of looking at things. When I read Dostoevsky later, I like Dostoevsky, he really goes into this a lot, this whole worldview, which, you know, has had a strong influence on the modern world, actually. And this really did affect me. I felt like this blackness was closing in around me more and more and more. This kind of hopeless, because I was sort of intellectual and would think about these things on my own a lot. And the prospect seemed so completely hopeless that I started thinking, well, I should just kill myself because there's no worth in leading a life like this. It's completely empty and completely worthless. I was thinking a lot about that. And I remember one particular night when I was 16 and I was brooding on this topic. And I just felt everything was closing in on me, like this blackness was, I was in this little cone and it was getting more and more oppressive for me. And so this one night I was up in my room thinking about this, and I just thought to myself, there's no point in thinking about this anymore. It doesn't go anywhere. There's no point in looking for the meaning of life, because there is no such thing and cannot be anything like that because of death, you know. So there's no purpose in my brooding on these topics anymore. I know one thing, that I like being happy and I don't like being unhappy. It's not that being happy is worth anything. No, it's not. It's worthless. But I would prefer to be happy rather than miserable. So I'm going to try to find some way where the balance of happiness to misery is such as to be worth living, you know. Not just some set of circumstances, you know, like making a lot of money or so. I mean, that doesn't really answer it. Some approach where the balance would be worth going on with. And I gave myself 2 years to find something. And I said, if I haven't found something in 2 years, I'll commit suicide. Well, it was very soon after that I did have one friend, and we would talk about these things. You know, teenage boys late at night, staying up until 3 a.m. So one night we were talking, and he was saying, oh, there are these people, the Zen Buddhists, and somehow they're always happy. And no matter what happens to them or what you say to them, they're completely unaffected by it. It was kind of a 16-year-old teenage boy's version of what Zen Buddhists were. They're kind of thumbing their noses at the world, which is appealing when you're 16. But I don't know why on earth I believed my friend that there were such people, but somehow I did. I thought, well, if Zen Buddhists can do this, this possibility has to be there in the mix somehow. And my friend said, yeah. So there are all these really good bookstores in Providence where I was. I was right close to Brown University where my dad taught. And I had been reading existentialists, you know, Camus and Sartre and the sorts of philosophers that fit in well with my nihilism, as a matter of fact. So I went down to the bookstore and I got some books on Zen Buddhism. It was becoming kind of fashionable. This would be late 60s, 1968 or so. So there was a, you know, rising interest in Eastern religion. I didn't really know that yet, but, and so I bought some books on Zen Buddhism, and, you know, I read them, and I liked it, but there was a certain tone where Zen Buddhism is not for callow, young, teenage boys from the West looking for the meaning of life, which is like me, or having given up on the meaning of life. Zen Buddhism has to be distinguished from Hinayana Buddhism and Yogacara Buddhism, and you know, all these sort of distinctions where I wanted something that was really cut through and get right to me where I was. And now I like those books. I find them interesting, but it wasn't quite what I wanted. But I liked Zen Buddhism anyway. So I said, okay, well, whoever these Zen Buddhists were, if they had anything, they must have learned it from Buddha, right? Because I don't know why I believed that, but the teacher would have a higher level of truth than the ones taught. So this all was within a week or so. So I went down to the bookstore and I got books about Buddha, Buddha life and teachings. And I was blown away. I had never in my life encountered anybody like that. Just the person. And I sort of thought, why has no one ever told me about this before? You know, I was reading all these Teuton philosophers, Sartre and everybody. But here was a man giving an answer. See, again, I was, knew so little. But, Buddha's, I read, a central doctrine of Buddhism is the Four Noble Truths. And the first noble truth is life is suffering. And man, he nailed that one. And it's not just that people are miserable all the time. That's not the doctrine. It's that life is fundamentally dissatisfactory. And whether you're happy or whether you're miserable, you're never really satisfied. And I thought, he knows. I mean, look at the point he started at. And it certainly spoke right to me, because I was looking for a way to find more happiness than suffering, right? And that was exactly on point. And then the second noble truth really blew my mind. He said, there's a cause of suffering, not of sufferings like, if I don't have enough money, my cause is not having enough money, or, if my girlfriend rejects me, it's that my girlfriend rejects. It's not sufferings. Suffering itself has a cause, and the cause is desire. And I had never thought of that, and it is obviously true. The reason that we suffer is we want things. Again, I was stunned by the simplicity and the penetration of what the Buddha was saying. And then, the third noble truth, if you annihilate desire, you annihilate suffering. And the fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path, which is kind of like, sort of like good thoughts, good words, good deeds, which sounded an awful lot like what my parents and teachers were saying to me, as a matter of fact. But I was going to get around to the fourth noble truth by and by. But in the meantime, I really liked the first three. So my whole life changed right away. And I read these stories about the life of the Buddha, and they're really, really beautiful. His compassion for people, how as a boy, young man, he renounced the world and went through all these austerities and experienced nirvana. And my mental environment, instead of being filled up with these pictures of committing suicide or something, were all full of the images of India and Buddha. And I wasn't talking to my parents or anybody about this, but my whole, I brightened a lot. I mean, everything got much brighter for me. And I would, was reading, I actually didn't know very much about Buddhism, but what I knew made a real powerful impression, to say the least. I was overpowered by it, I would say, by Buddha, personally. See, Jesus had never been really presented to me in my life, as a matter of fact. I never had that. I never knew anybody who talked about it in a way that registered. But then after a couple months, one day the thought really hit me with great force. It's not enough for this just to be a philosophy. I need to actually do this, because Buddha's last words were, work out your salvation with diligence. And well, I should do that. And I should actually try to attain nirvana. I was still an atheist, I'd been very hostile to God. I hated God even, I would say. And now I was a little bit not quite so hateful towards God, but I certainly didn't believe in God. I was a materialist still. This was just a way of escaping from suffering and the bondage to suffering. But I should do this. I was aware that there were Buddhists in the picture, in the West, in America at that time. Buddhism had certain adherents, but becoming a Buddhist couldn't mean anything so jejune or so boring as joining a sect. I wasn't going to do that. What I should do is renounce the world and become a beggar and try to seek nirvana. And when it came to that, I was scared of it. I was living up in Rhode Island, and the winters are really, severe, lots of snow. And I guess I could have become a Buddhist beggar in Florida, but that was kind of like cheating, right? I had to really deal with the full hardship of it. And I wasn't sure that I had what it takes to do it. But on the other hand, all the logic of everything was leading to that. So, it was kind of a dilemma. So again, I gave myself 2 years. The 2-year deadline for finding a method Buddhism was it, or Buddha was it, a method for dealing with the problem of suffering. Okay, that was answered. So I gave myself 2 years to prepare. The other factor was that, I had very good parents, and they were, but they had a general worldly view, and they wanted me to have a good career. And right at the time I got into Harvard, which was really a big deal, so everyone was assuming I would go. And so I said, okay, I'll give myself 2 years to inwardly prepare to pursue my real career. And then at the end of my freshman year, I would tell my parents to break the bad news about my career plans, renounce the world, and become a beggar, which was not their idea at all of what I should do, nor anybody else's. But that's what I decided to do. And this is right at the end of my high school year, and I was the best student in the class that year. I was in this kind of environment of intellectualism and intellectual achievement. That was always there. But I was going to renounce all of it, and I knew that, in Buddhist terms, all of this was worthless. But then the year came to an end, and all the senior in high school, and I had lots of friends then, and was popular to an extent, and it was very, very busy. But the school year ended, and I had to have a surgery. It wasn't a major, it incapacitated me for a couple of weeks, so not a serious danger or anything. And my parents were really worried about what on earth was going on with me. They couldn't figure it out at all. And I, of course, wouldn't say a word to them because they were benighted troglodytes. Back in the 60s, the older generation was comprised of benighted troglodytes for the most part, on the view of my generation. So my parents were troglodytes also. But they dragged me on this driving trip from the East Coast all around the West Coast of America, and they forced me to go because they didn't trust me to be on my own at all. And they were quite right not to trust me, as a matter of fact. So we went on this big trip, and I had a more compassionate attitude towards my parents than I had had before, because Buddhists should be compassionate, and these benighted people, I'm sure it must have been so irritating to them. I look back at myself and, oh God, how they put up with me, I can't imagine. But we would camp out. We didn't stay in hotels, we camped out in national parks in a tent and stuff. And so part of my training to become a Buddhist was that I should learn how to meditate. I really didn't know a damn thing about Buddhism, actually, and I had never met any Buddhists either, and I somehow, didn't occur to me that maybe I should. But I would go off into the woods, and I was going to meditate. And I had the idea that you have to get in the lotus position. You know the lotus position where you put your feet up like this? And it was always agony for me. And after about 5 minutes, I couldn't. And the prospects for my becoming a Buddhist beggar and achieving nirvana didn't seem so great if I couldn't stay in the lotus position for more than 5 minutes. There are a lot of bad, inauspicious signs. But anyway, I tried to do it out in the woods somewhere. And then, of course, mosquitoes. But, a bodhisattva should be unaffected by mosquitoes. Whereas for me, they drove me nuts. So I would do my meditation. But the meditation, I didn't have any idea how to meditate. I didn't even know that there was anything to know, But I picked what was actually a very good one. I picked that I would be sitting in my lotus position for as long as I could, and Buddha was sitting 5 or 6 feet away from me, and I would look at him and he would look at me, and that was my meditation. That's actually a really good meditation. So I would do that every night, wandering off from the tent where my parents were sleeping, and I would meditate for a little while. And it was kind of a heavenly period in a certain way, and I really developed a love for wide open expanses and mountains and deserts. America has a lot of that. A couple of years ago, I drove across Australia having similar experience. I love that kind of landscape, and that was the time where I really experienced it. But when driving in the car, I would, sometimes when you're in a group of people, a large group of people, I'll have the experience, it's almost like someone is touching my face or something, and I'll look, and someone is looking at me, and I realize they've been looking at me for 10 seconds and sort of focused, and almost always, both people get embarrassed and you looked away. Well, I would be driving and I would suddenly have the feeling that someone was looking at me, and I think, well, I'm in the car, who could it be? And I would think about it, and suddenly I would remember Buddha. And I would think, Buddha's looking at me. And I was still a kind of a materialistic atheist, and Buddha was long dead. I didn't believe that he could still be there. But it was it gave me the strangest feeling I'd ever had in my life, And I sort of wanted to believe that Buddha really was looking at me, even though I had no basis for believing in that. But this kept happening, I had the feeling that Buddha was looking at me. And I was thinking about that, and I had read a book that was saying, after Buddha died, Anand was one of his great disciples. He was the Erich of that time, or the Peter of that time. And the people would come to him, and he would tell them, yes, Buddha is still here. Buddha is still accessible. If you pray to him, you can find him. And the scholar who wrote this book said, well, Anand, he loved Buddha, but he didn't really understand his teachings. Buddha was talking about a state beyond its time and space, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when I read that, I thought, yeah, the scholar's right. But I was having this thing of feeling Buddha was looking at me, and suddenly I thought, well, who really knew Buddha better, Anand or the scholar who wrote this book? Well, obviously, Anand did. So why am I believing the scholar and not Anand? And, the objective was to attain nirvana, right? And nirvana is beyond time and space. That was the cliche. And so I repeated the cliche, even though I didn't really believe it. But suddenly I thought, okay, if Buddha is in a state beyond time and space, I'm in time and space. What would that look like to me? That would look like here, now, right? Beyond time and space, from my perspective, would be here, now. And if I was experiencing Buddha looking at me, maybe from that timeless, spaceless state, he really was there. Maybe it was for real. I hadn't actually believed in any of it before, but it was that experience of feeling that Buddha was looking at me that sort of had this really big impact. So then this summer trip, it was, a profound experience for me. It seemed like it at the time. So then the summer trip came to an end, and I went to college. First time I was away from home, up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, only about 40 miles from Providence. And so I was a freshman in this hyper-intellectual environment of Harvard, but I was just going to finish my freshman year and then drop out and pursue my career as a beggar, to the dismay of my parents and everybody else who knew me. But I was fasting, and I was, I had meditating. I didn't know a damn thing about Buddhism or any other subject, but it didn't even occur to me that maybe I should find out about any of it. But then it was the 22nd of November. It was a Friday afternoon, and the same friend who had told me about Zen Buddhism years before that was my roommate. We both got into Harvard. Big deal in my world, everything was, what college do you go to? And I have no respect for that at all. But in those days, it was such a big thing. And so we were roommates. And we had just been in Harvard Yard, which is the big square. And in those days, this was still kind of hippie era. So Harvard Yard square was absolutely flooded with beatniks and bums and hippies and all kinds of people like that. And I had just been there and I bought a Rolling Stone magazine. It was under my arm. I hadn't looked at it yet. So my friend and I were going into the dormitory Friday afternoon. It's always, even for bodhisattvas renouncing the world, Friday afternoon is kind of nice. Thinking what I was going to do for the weekend. And my friend said, "Oh, that's Meher Baba. He says that he's the Buddha." And I went, because I knew that Buddha had said that he would be coming back as the Maitreya Buddha. And I had been sort of thinking, this is the kind of age where he would come. I certainly had thought that, and was aware of that. So my friend says it's the Buddha. So it was a flyer on the wall for a talk that night, just 3 hours from then. And it was a talk by Alan Cohen. Many of you will know Alan Cohen. He's a, prominent Baba lover. And it was on LSD, consciousness, and Meher Baba. And that was a topic designed to bring in the crowds at Harvard, because LSD, Harvard is where the LSD experimentation began, actually. The pioneer was Timothy Leary. Everybody in those days knew who Timothy Leary was. And he had been a professor at Harvard. And Alan Cohen had been a graduate student under Timothy Leary and his colleague Richard Alpert, who's also very famous now. And so I had been, even back in the days when life was completely meaningless, and I always had the thought, if I had a little button and I could just push it and the whole world would be annihilated, if I felt like doing that, I should do it, because the whole world is worthless. Why should I worry about anybody else? So even in the days where I might push the button and annihilate the world, I had refrained from taking LSD because I heard it might be bad for my health. All these, and I knew at the time how ridiculous. I was being totally hypocritical to my own creed. So I hadn't taken LSD, but I had finally decided, okay, I'll do it. And I probably would have that very weekend, as a matter of fact. And at Harvard, LSD was everywhere, in those days. So it was on my mind. So LSD, consciousness, and Meher Baba. The topic made complete sense. I didn't know who Alan Cohen was at the time, but it had a photo of Baba in it, and my friend had said he was the Buddha. And I looked at it, and I had been expecting someone young and ageless. That was my picture of the Buddha. Whereas they picked like the 1967 passport photo, a very old Baba, which wasn't exactly what I was expecting. But I looked at it and I thought, this man has obviously suffered. It was on his face. But it's for the sake of love that he suffered. I could see that. It wasn't ordinary suffering. So it was a little bit surprising in a way, but I was going to go to that talk for sure. So I went up to my room with my roommate and I opened up the Rolling Stone, and the cover story was an article by Pete Townsend, the rock superstar, member of the group The Who, and he was really big in those days. He had, the album Tommy had come out not long before, so everybody knew who he was, and of course I did. And it was about Meher Baba. The whole cover was a picture of Meher Baba and an article about Meher Baba by Pete Townsend. And so immediately I read it, and I was going to go to this lecture about, hour or two later. And so he quotes Meher Baba from The Highest of the High. And Baba says, I'm not a wali or a satpurush or a peer or this or that. And then later on, I am the Ancient One, the highest of the high. And when I read that, it was like somebody rang a bell in me that I hadn't even known was there. And I felt only the Buddha could have said this. This is the voice of the Buddha. Immediately, I didn't even have these thoughts, but this was the very, very clear impression. I would say to this very day, it hasn't, that impression is still there. So that night I went to this lecture, and as it turned out, all the other, kids on my floor also went to it. But I didn't want to go with them because I knew they would just be snickering and making wisecracks. And so I snuck off and went on my own. And it was although they were there, and it was a huge lecture hall. There were about 1,000 people. There was a ground floor and a balcony, completely full. And Alan gave this talk about Baba, and he's really an excellent speaker, and he's really skillful at dealing with an audience of that type. And he said who Baba was. He didn't mince words at all. He was God in human form. He was the avatar of the age, all that kind of thing. He said not to take drugs. Alan said that right to this Harvard audience. I mean, it was sort of gutsy in those days to say that. And he said that Meher Baba said he was God in human form. And I was still sort of an atheist, I guess, because Buddha never talked about God. He never affirmed the existence of God. He denied the self, no Atma, and no Paramatma. So which made Buddha easier for me to swallow coming out of my existentialist days. And I wasn't hostile to God anymore as I had been. I was sort of tolerant that this is a way of thinking about things, But if Meher Baba said he actually was God and had infinite knowledge and infinite power and infinite bliss, that was quite a shock. And I didn't even think this thought, even though this thought was there right after the lecture, and I just felt, well, anything Meher Baba says is true, and if he says he's God, well, I guess God exists. And that was the answer to that question for me. Ever since then, I was just absolutely certain that whatever Baba said was true. And so at the end of the lecture, I just wanted more, So there was a big line of people asking Alan Cohen questions like, well, if Meher Baba never took LSD, how would he know that it's harmful spiritually? And Alan was good. He would say, well, the real question is, was Meher Baba God in human form? Because if he was God, he would know. He actually would give that answer, he was good. And all sorts of these Harvard nerds, for whom I had no respect at all at that point. All those old existentialist philosophers and everything, it's like, where the hell have those people been with Buddha and now Meher Baba? They talk a good game and like to impress other intellectuals, but they're just bullshitters. That was my point of view. And basically it still is, tell the truth. But finally the whole line was gone, and so Alan was looking at me like, do I have a question? And I couldn't think of one single question to ask. My whole life had been totally changed. I had found out that God exists and Meher Baba was God. And at Harvard, you're taught to question absolutely anything, and particularly things like this. bogus bullshit people like Meher Baba. And I just wanted to ask a question just to keep it going. And I couldn't think of one single question. So I got completely embarrassed and I just left him back to my room. And when I got back to my room that night, I was doing this meditation, but I didn't do it that night, but I sat in the place. And I realized that I had found the answer for me, and that I had been born to follow and serve Meher Baba. And it was, that whole experience was, all these mental gyrations I had been through and all this intellectual questioning and everything was completely gone. It was absolutely clear. And I would really say that fundamentally that has never changed from this day to that day to this, that complete certainty about who Meher Baba is really hasn't changed one little bit. So that's my story of how I came to Baba. So, Jai Baba.